All right, welcome back, guys. Let's talk about the Great Compromise. So, we talked about the first Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation, and that was a failure. We went over many reasons on why it failed. Everything from there was no really true national unity of currency. The government itself couldn't pay its debts. It was the states that had to pay their debts. There's no executive branch. There really was no judicial branch. Um, it was just kind of like a conglomeration of a bunch of states that came together for something like declaring war. It was about all they could do, and it worked well enough that we actually won the Continental Army could win against the British in the Revolutionary War, as we call it in America, or the War of Independence. Uh, However, it came pretty close to collapsing even then. So now we're going to talk about this new Constitution. And the Constitution we actually have today, the United States Constitution of 1787, it's actually ratified in 1788. And this Constitution is the one that we're going to look at all school year. And this is the one we look at daily. And this is and what the government has to constantly reference, and the Supreme Court has to constantly reference. And we're going to see how they work this out. Okay, we've talked about James Madison is kind of the father of this Constitution, and he writes up most of the Constitution with the input of all these other founding fathers or the framers of the Constitution. They built this frame to hold this picture of what we call the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution today. And we're going to figure out how they work some stuff out, because there's definitely some big challenges. And I think that some historians, political scientists would argue that Madison said that, look, if we make it loose enough, people can interpret and get what they want out of it. And maybe that's what will hold it all together. But there definitely has to be some clear compromises, and we're going to look at what those compromises had to be. And it worked. They got rid of the Articles of Confederation. They started over, and they worked a system that we still use today. Now, you can agree or disagree whether or not we need more changes or we need less changes, or you think it's perfect the way it is. But so far, it's still intact. We've just amended it only about 17 times after the Bill of Rights, the first couple amendments. So let's look at this. So we can see at the top, you've got this Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan we're going to talk about. We're going to put those together and come to the Great Compromise. We also call it the Connecticut Compromise. So if you ever heard somebody say the Connecticut Compromise, that's the actual compromise we went with. Okay, so first let's look at the New Jersey plan. So you can see that New Jersey on the right is a smaller state. And I hope you like the fireworks. I think it works perfect for 4th of July and the patriotic sentiment of learning about the Constitution. The New Jersey plan proposed that Congress be made up of one unicameral system. Una meaning one, cameral, one house system, okay? So they kind of wanted to keep it the way it was under the Articles of Confederation. So very much kind of like what we would call the UN today. So the UN, every country, regardless of how big or small they are, get one vote. And obviously the larger countries, and in this case in America, the larger states are like, wait, what? Because you think about America has 320 million people, while like Haiti might have like 3 million people. Well, that's a big difference in population, but they both get one vote in the United Nations. And however, in the UN there is a veto. There is a veto power under the five head countries. We're not going to get into that. But what I want you to focus in on with the New Jersey plan, they wanted to keep New Jersey as a small population, a small state. We're not talking so much about physical land, but the number of people are actually in there. They wanted the state to one representative per state when they vote. So they had equal power with Virginia. Well, Virginia on the other side of it is the most populated state, and they're like, no way. We do not want that at all. We want more power. So under the New Jersey plan, one house, we have equal representation for all 13 colonies, and that's how they would vote things out. So this proposal is not going to work because it doesn't take into account the big states like Virginia or New York that had larger populations. Now, Virginia on the other side has another plan. They say, look, we're going to create what's called the Virginia Plan. Now, this is almost the complete opposite. They say, look, not only do we need to get rid of the one house system, we need to have two houses, a bicameral system, where the number of representatives would be based only on population. So the Senate, how many senators you have would be based on population, and how many representatives in the House of Representatives would be based on the population. So this is a win-win for Virginia. So today, for example, in the House of Representatives, we do use this idea. We have about 750,000 people, about, give or take, per one representative in America. There's 435 representatives. So we'll talk more about that later when we actually get to the legislative branch today. So back then, though, they wanted it based on a number across the board based on some kind of population. Obviously, 750,000 people was way too big. I mean, the country probably just had a couple million people at the time. So it might be like 50,000 or 20,000 people at the time got a representative. The compromise in the House of now today, we actually passed a law about less than 100 years ago that says that, hey, now there's 435 representatives in the House of Representatives, and that's how it works today, and that's why we have about 750,000. So if you're District 1, you've got Cori Bush as the new rep, and she has about 750,000 people that she represents. And if you're District 2 right now, it's Ann Wagner as the rep, and she has about 750,000 people in this area. And all the adjacent areas have their own reps. And that's why you'll see when we look at maps later on that the states have much bigger areas and much smaller areas of representation, because you think of like St. Louis, and St. Louis County has the most populated areas. We have 1 million people in the county and then over 300,000 people in the city. That's a lot. That's 1.3 million people in those two areas. So right there's two reps. But they actually cut the districts differently than just like based on the county or the city. And we'll look at that later. But then you go to like southern Missouri and you can have a gigantic district, because 750,000 people in southern Missouri might be like half of southern Missouri before you can cover that much area. So that's why actually if you see a smaller district, that means it's just more densely populated. Okay. So those plans are going to have to work out or have to come some kind of compromise. The next issue is a big issue, is slavery. And slavery is going to mean a lot more to certain groups than others. And we kind of saw, we could talk about, you could think logically, regionally, obviously in the South, slavery is very important. The Southerners are they feel outnumbered proportionally. Like Georgia is more scantily populated than New York or Connecticut. Okay. So we said, so the idea is that we got to come up with some kind of deal. And the Southerners are like, look, we should be able to count our slaves. So if somebody's a master, they should be able to count all their slaves towards their vote. So if they own 10 slaves, they get 11 votes, one for themselves and 10 votes based on the number of slaves. But if you're in the North, you're against this because you're like, wait a second, that means you're getting all these extra votes, and that gives the Southern plantation owners a lot of power. And also, could somebody just literally buy slaves just to have votes? So that's kind of a scary concept. Now, the compromise on this one is that the Northerners are like, look, in order for us to get this country together, get this thing going, you can't have every slave count. But how about 3 out of 5? And they're going to call this the 3/5 compromise. So 3 out of 5 slaves that somebody owned counted towards their vote of a master. It's really an insane thing to think about, that we could even proportionally value people, but they did it. So for every 5 slaves that a master owned, he had 3 more votes in the house. Okay? So I want you to be clear on this. Now, the reason probably the Northerners went along with this as well is because a lot of the Northerners, like the New Yorkers and the people from Connecticut and Boston, they're thinking, first of all, in Pennsylvania too, because remember, Pennsylvania itself, slavery is against the law. Actually, George Washington, when he was president in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first capital, he had to take his slaves back to Virginia every 3 months, because if he left them too long in Virginia, past 3 months, they're emancipated, which means they were just free from slavery. So that's how dedicated he was to keeping his slaves, which is interesting because in his death, him and Margaret actually freed their slaves in the end. So they must have had some kind of insight that it wasn't all good, and it was not the best institution. But at the same time, they used it and were okay with it at the time. So the Northerners are going, look, we got to try to keep this thing together. And honestly, slavery was kind of falling out. It was expensive to buy a slave. It was probably cheaper just to get poor white people to farm your land, or or to, there's other ways to make money and just hire poor hands, like hands for food, or poor money or a little bit of money in the South. So the Northerners are thinking, look, slavery is going to go away anyway. Why push this issue? There's not as many slaves in America really anyway. Boy, were they wrong. They never saw what was coming. And if you guys know what was coming, it was the invention of the cotton gin, which was almost immediately after the Great Compromise that we're talking about. So while this gets ratified and done in 1788, by 1793, Eli Whitney had went down to Georgia. He's an interesting guy. While he's from Connecticut, and he's a pretty open-minded person, not really for slavery, not completely against it, but not for it. He goes down to Georgia, and he gets invited to a plantation. He's kind of tutoring a wealthy plantation owner's children, because he's a very educated man. And he looks in the fields, and he sees all these African slaves. And he asks the plantation owner, "Why do you have so many slaves?" And the guy says, It's the cotton. Cotton, we grow cotton here. It's a very expensive product. We make a lot of money off of, but it's very labor intensive. You have to have somebody sit there and pull the seeds out of the cotton, because cotton, it grows from the ground, and you pull the seeds out basically one by one kind of thing. It takes a lot of slaves or labor to do this, so it's cheaper to just buy slaves. Whitney actually thinks to himself, look, I could help this whole situation. He's kind of a genius inventor guy. And he goes, I got it. I'm going to create a cotton gin, which is just a wheel with kind of like spikes that you turn and it pulls the seeds out. And he goes, boom, bada boom, bada bing. Solved, problem solved. And he thinks slavery's done. Why do you even need slaves anymore? I mean, they're expensive. It's not really making sense. It's cheaper probably just to get cheap labor to do it. Boy, it did the complete opposite. Cotton becomes king, because now in America, the American plantation owners are buying cotton gins, and they could pump out 55 pounds of clean cotton a day. So they start selling this like crazy to England and Germany. The countries are starting to really, especially England with their textile mills, so they can make clothes. It is just so lucrative. So they end up buying more and more and more slaves. And at first, finally, even the Southerners agree, look, 1808, we're going to end the slave trade at least. It didn't end. It ended legally, but there was a lot of underground slave trade. Slaves were brought in from other countries. It's disgusting. There was breeding of people. We've talked about these terms come from there. And it just blows the whole thing out. You get millions and millions of people are slaves now in the South. So it actually does the complete opposite. And the great interesting thing and the irony of this is, while Whitney was probably in a lot of ways trying to get rid of slavery, he sparked it. But on the other side of it, he invents what's called the interchangeable parts. So he says if you make the parts all the same on a gun or a tool, and then you could put them together, so if something breaks, you could fix it. Well, guess who used interchangeable parts next? During the Civil War, it was the North. The Union used interchangeable parts, and what they found out is if they gave all the soldiers Springfield rifles, they all had the same gun, they would just interchange the part. And what would happen as a result is their guns were maintained better, and they could shoot the same gun all the time. And I know that sounds weird to people. It's like, what's the big deal if you don't shoot guns? People would be like, what's the big deal? Why don't you just pick up a gun from a dead person and shoot it? But I think people that shoot guns would say, no. All guns shoot a certain way. You got to learn how the gun shoots, especially back then. If they're shooting a musket or a bullet, one at a time, those things are really inaccurate. So it curves to the right or the left. So it's better just to change the part than try to grab somebody's gun and shoot it and hope you hit something. So in a lot of ways, he did the opposite. He helped the Union win the Civil War because they were using unified interchangeable parts for their weapons and other items, and that really helped them defeat with manufacturing the South. All right, so the Great Compromise is in the end is the fact that we call it the Connecticut Compromise as well. So you'll see that on tests and quizzes, and people say that it's correct. They created an American government that is a combination of the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. And this is actually how our government works today. Under the Great Compromise, the House of Representatives is based on about 750,000 people for each of the 435 reps that we have today. So the whole House of Representatives, the bottom house, the big house, and the most powerful house because they can actually pass revenue bills that have to do with money. They're going to be based on like kind of the House of Commons, like the British, like we're the regular people, and they're going to be represented based on how many people there is. So Virginia's going to definitely have more representatives than New Jersey. But what's going to make New Jersey happy is the upper house, the Senate, and this is kind of modeled on the British Parliament. So they have a House of Commons, which is kind of the regular guys at the bottom. We call that the House of Representatives. And then we have a Senate, and in the British parliamentary system, they call it the House of Lords. So their House of Lords are going to be these almost wealthier elite senators at first, and they're going to get 2 for each state. So instead of 1 rep, they're going to get 2. So this is going to be equal across the board. So it doesn't matter if you're New Jersey and you want to get a slice of the Coke, they got 2 senators. But then if you go to Virginia, who has lots and lots and lots of people, they've got 2 senators as well. We talk about the beginning of the United States, and most of the presidents are even from Virginia because it's the most populated state by far. So now we're starting to be, everybody's being like, all right, this might work. If we have 2 houses, then the states will get their equal representation, and that makes us happy if you're Connecticut or Delaware or one of the small states or Rhode Island. However, if you're a bigger state like New York or Virginia, you are going to get more reps in the House. So we compromised on this. And now the whole slavery thing has been compromised as well. Slavery is going to go away anyway. Let the Southerners have 3 out of 5 of their slaves count as a vote. So 3/5 of their representatives